Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. Today's episode is part of a special mini-series called Ramadan Reflections, where I talk to guests about faith, life, and Ramadan. I'm thrilled to be joined by poet and creative producer Imrana Mahmood for a conversation about creativity and faith, the role of Ramadan, and the importance of Muslim representation in literature and on stage and screen. Imrana is a poet, curator, and creative producer who has dedicated her career to amplifying underrepresented voices in the arts. With a background in community driven projects, she has worked extensively to create spaces for diverse creatives to thrive. Her work is deeply rooted in storytelling, activism, and faith, exploring themes of identity, belonging, and spirituality. She's collaborated with leading arts organizations and has played a key role in shaping conversations around Muslim representation in the UK's literary and creative industries. In this episode, we'll be diving into Imrana's journey, how faith informs her creativity, the challenges and opportunities for Muslim artists today, and what true representation looks like in the arts. Assalamu alaikum, Imrana. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Walaikum assalam. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing really, really well. Obviously, we're over halfway through Ramadan and just in that final stretch. So, trying to make the most of it at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I found this to be a really interesting Ramadan. I mean, it's flying like always,
Mm.
but I think the days are also like moving very rapidly.
Mm.
I think, they're still relatively short as compared to previous years. And so I think maybe that's why. But you and I, we talk a lot. Like we hang out a lot and we talk, but this is the first time we're talking on the podcast. So it's very exciting. And I'm so glad to be able to host you. So I want to know a little bit about your journey into creative work. So I know that actually your sort of academic and initial professional work was not in the creative sector. You took a more what we term as like traditional route, but you now spend pretty much all of your time in the creative sector. So can you tell me a little bit about what your journey was like in that transition from moving from a more traditional background to creative?
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for that question. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did that typical, I don't know what to say, brown girl thing of being encouraged to follow kind of science subjects and took biology, for example, for my degree. And, science is a subject I always loved. I really enjoyed studying it at university. And I think it was just one of those things that there was a keen interest. I went into teaching, so I was a science teacher at secondary school. Um, but there was always this kind of underlying, I think, interest in things that were creative. I loved poetry. I loved reading it. I loved writing it. Um, and I think just generally really enjoying going to different, maybe I guess, events or galleries, museums, and just taking in things that have interest to me about the world and culture. And it just so happened that it was a particular exhibition that I'd attended with my dad, and we're talking now quite a few years ago. I think it was maybe 2016, and it was an exhibition by photographer Peter Sanders. And we bumped into him. There was a bit, we had a bit of a conversation about the exhibition itself, and he kind of just mentioned in passing that he would love for this exhibition, which was called The Art of Integration, to kind of tour the UK. It'd been all over the world, but for some reason in the UK, it'd only ever been, I think, exhibited in London. And I said, oh, well, why don't I try to find out? There's a gallery in my kind of hometown. And yeah, I just found out about, oh, you can actually there's bucket loads of funding, and there's all this money that's kind of sitting there that is being ready, that they want people to access it. And yeah, it kind of just started, and I realized how much I enjoyed working with artists, creating those kind of spaces that we can, use for self-expression, I guess, and especially um, being, I guess, kind of the diaspora and what that means in terms of identity, I think was really interesting to me. And yeah, I just never looked back.
Well, I'm very glad that you never looked back. But yeah, and I just, I think it's so i- like inspiring, or like so maybe hopefully like relatable to so many people, to be able to have in your life explored more than one field and more than one sector, and to give yourself also the time, like maybe the 19-year-old version of yourself that was at uni doing science wouldn't have been ready really to explore the creative world in the way that you are now. And you spoke a little bit about your experience or your interest in exploring diaspora identities, which is something I'm also really, really fascinated by and really interested in. But what about when it comes to faith? How do you think that faith intersects with your own creativity, but also just the creative arts in general?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. I think for myself, as kind of a visible Muslim woman working in the creative sector, and what that's meant in terms of how I navigate certain spaces, obviously very different to when I was kind of teaching. It was very much kind of go into school, obviously kind of impart whatever you can in terms of enabling students' knowledge. But I never felt like I was ever questioning the way I'm being perceived, I guess, in that space as a teacher. Whereas that transition into the creative sector, I was on many occasions in spaces where I was the only Muslim woman, maybe the only South Asian, the only person of color. And then you suddenly start feeling like, oh, right, okay, this is very different. And you kind of almost feel, I guess, hyper visible. And then the way then what you go about then creating work is, I think, is an interesting process. And I think partly that might be the reason why a lot of my work has focused on working particularly with British Muslim women. So three of the projects that I've done, with funding from Arts Council England, has been really looking at this, yeah, I guess Muslim women's stories. And one of the most recent projects that I did, it was called Echoes of the Diaspora. And it was literally working with Muslim women saying, what are the stories that you want to tell? Because, as you all know, such a massive narrative, especially within the UK context, because of the media, because of rising Islamophobia, the way that Muslim women are spoken about. Um, it was, I guess, initially I felt there was a need of, oh, I really want to challenge and break these stereotypes. And, maybe I, for a short while, fell into this trap of just wanting to constantly challenge it. But then I think over time I thought, actually, you know what, I don't want that responsibility, and I don't really feel it's my job to then continuously, perpetually be engaging or trying to engage, what's the word, kind of educate others about this. So I think a lot of my work is really now rooted in joy, and what makes us happy, and yeah, and ultimately, yeah, the stories that we want to tell, I guess, in our on our own terms.
That's so interesting, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit. So, just as you were talking, I was thinking that there must be so many careers in life where your background or your identity doesn't really impact the work that you do. For example, if you are an accountant, maybe, or if you're working in IT, for example, maybe being a visibly Muslim woman or being an older white man, for example, may not impact the way that you do your work and therefore the consequences of your work on other people. Maybe it does, but I would assume less so. But but creativity and teaching to definitely to some degree as well. But I would say, but creativity, because it is such a personal expression, is is going to be massively impacted by who you are and sort of the politics around your identity. And as Muslims, it feels like our identities are constantly and always just so politically charged. They're not discharged, not disassociated from the world around us or from the politics or current affairs. How do you navigate that sort of, this is my this is my profession, I'm also trying to grow in this authentically in a way that will help me progress as a practitioner, as an expert, but also hold space for, but this is also my lived experience and this is my personal expression.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. I guess, to some extent, there's something definitely there about the complexities of when we talk about identity and the different facets of how we, I guess, present ourselves in kind of different spheres. And I think that there's been this, I guess, almost like I don't want to call it like a conflict, but it's some sort of battle, I think, within myself in terms of, I know there are times where things feel very tokenistic. So
Mm.
if there is a particular project that's taking place, or I've been approached to work on, whatever it might be, a particular resource or something like that, I always feel like I have to question that, is this person or is this organization ticking a particular box? Because
Yes.
when it
Mm.
comes to, and like when I first came into the sector, it's not being used as much now, but this kind of quote of hard to reach was, so there was, this particular quote that was being constantly used of hard to reach communities. And I just think, God, like, what does that mean? Like, you are putting an onus on communities and certain people, saying that somehow they're responsible for their own, what you perceive as a lack of engagement, but you're not actually acknowledging the own barrier, the barriers that you're putting up yourselves, and the inaccessibility of your own organization, let's say. um, so knowing the fact that obviously I'm South Asian, I'm Muslim, I'm a woman, I'm ticking these boxes. Am I being approached for that reason? And I think sometimes that does make me feel, I don't know, maybe doubt myself a little bit. But at the same time, I'm not actually, what, I have to constantly tell myself the story that, no, that, I'm really capable and I'm good at what I do. And it's me just trying to create meaning through like the different work we're trying to create. So whether it is looking at, photography or theatre, or whatever it is that we might be focusing on in a particular project. um and then a lot of people talk about that sense of imposter syndrome, but I try to quash that as much as I can as well, because actually, there's so much more that I bring into a space, with the experience that I have, with the knowledge that I have. And yeah, and just kind of trusting the fact that that's the reason, I'm being approached to do work. And yeah, and ultimately why I'm doing it in the first place as well, is to make a difference.
Yeah, it's a really hard one to navigate, that, and you sort of fall into this pit of like, "Well, am I just a conspiracy theorist? Like, am I overthinking?" And not, and trying to remind yourself like, "Not everybody's against me, it's okay." But it's so challenging because there are so many different agendas, and not just in terms of like people meeting diversity quota, but is it helpful for some narrative surrounding capitalism, or is it helpful for some narrative surrounding a pro-Zionist agenda, or is it helpful for them to have a visibly Muslim woman leading on this project or being the face of the project? And people are not upfront about that kind of stuff, and it is really difficult to navigate that. And this is where I think something like community can really help, to lean into the support of others and to be able to seek counsel from people that may have similar experiences. And I know that you do a lot of work in building community, in facilitating creative spaces. I know you run a women's only book club as well, which is a fantastic example of a community space that brings women together that may not have otherwise come together. And you don't just end up talking about the book from start to finish. No book club is ever like that. It's about themes and issues and experiences. And I think that anybody that ever comes to the book club takes away so much. But what do you really think about creative spaces? And as again, like as Muslims, how can the existence of spaces or the creation of spaces really help with sort of being able to express oneself creatively, but also to find opportunities for work?
Yeah, and I think there's kind of 2 points to that. The first being that sense of um, the spaces that we are able to provide, how much of it is really kind of genuine and authentic, and saying, actually, you know what, that want a creative outlet. Because otherwise, you can do lots of things. You can go out with friends and family, and you will constantly have that kind of soul to soul kind of connection, and that's so healthy and good. But I think there's something so specific about when we talk about creative outlets and what that means, because what in essence you're doing, you really are channeling something which is really deep inside, and you're kind of manifesting that in a way which is, I guess, really beautiful. So it could be through words, it could be through calligraphy, it could be through dance, it could be, and it is so wonderful meeting different people, and actually witnessing that manifestation almost in kind of real time. So I run lots of different workshops. I work with artists, obviously, who facilitate workshops as well, and ultimately it really is about connecting with that inner, I guess, that I want to say inner artist. I know it sounds a bit might sound a bit kind of corny, but it literally is that. I think we all have something within us, and you touched on that aspect of our faith and being Muslim, and we know when we talk about arts and culture, it's such a massive part of our kind of heritage, Islamically as well, and this idea of traditions and how do we almost take on that mantle and continue that throughout the generations. So I think there's that aspect of really enjoying what you do, trying to really understand, okay, what is it that I am good at, because that's such a good starting point. Or it could just be, actually, what am I interested in, and then attend a workshop or follow certain artists who do that work, and see how they've approached certain things. So so there's that aspect. And then what you were saying about kind of actually making work and maybe a profession out of it. I think that sense of professionalism is something important but almost secondary, because I
Mm.
think if you either you can keep something a hobby, or you can say, actually, what, I'm really good at this thing, and actually I think I can really make something of myself in this space. And by doing that, you're again becoming a bearer of something which is really wholesome and meaningful, and sharing it with like the rest of the community, or wherever you might be. So I have no idea if that answers your question, but that's kind of what it was making me think of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it can feel very isolating, I think, for Muslim creatives, but also I think Muslims in any sector, when you feel like you're the only one doing, or you're one of very few people doing the things that you're doing. But I think what we do know is that there are actually lots of people doing the things that we all want to do, or the things that we want to see. And it's important that we are able to identify and uplift those, because I think that's the problem, is that work is happening, but people don't know that it's happening. I do think that there are some circles that are still very closed in the creative industry. I think most prominently in like acting, for example, I think those circles are very, very closed. Tends to be a certain kind of person with a certain kind of background. It's very difficult to get into those circles. But I would say even like maybe even some poetry circles, especially in certain cities, like in London. Although you would assume that London is very open, I think it can feel very cliquey, and so it's difficult to navigate that. But as you said, like I think it's important to at least identify what's being done, and then to try and attend, and to make the effort to connect. And I think it just makes such a difference. And obviously, like being being Muslim creatives, a lot of Muslim creatives, a lot of poets, or a lot of people working on plays end up doing so with regard to their Muslim identity. So they're writing about lived experiences, or they're writing about issues that are important to them, that are connected to their faith or their experiences. It's not always autobiographical. And so it can end up that you end up doing Muslim centric work that ends up existing in Muslim centric spaces. And that's wonderful for Muslims. It's so great as a Muslim to see representation and to see those stories and to hear those stories. But it sometimes doesn't feel enough, right? It feels like, but we're preaching to the converted almost, right? We're existing in echo chambers. It's not always helpful if you go to an event and you're in a room with everybody that agrees with you or everybody that understands where you're coming from. It's nice in so many ways, but if we think about like movement or progression in society, it doesn't feel like it's doing enough to move it forward. And so actually like entering what, quote unquote mainstream spaces or having the attention of the mainstream audience is super important, but it's such a difficult thing to get right. Do you have any thoughts or insights on this, on how Muslim artists can or are trying, or the struggles that they have in accessing these spaces?
You know, I have to say, I think the wonderful thing has been the fact that in the past few years, to see how many Muslim creatives now there are in different fields making work, and I think it's absolutely spectacular that we've got that, and the opportunities are coming along. We're in spaces and positions that actually we are accessing and actually getting that funding. Maybe we are getting support from certain institutions, and that's definitely good. But I totally understand what you mean in terms of how much then of our self-expression is about our faith and the importance, because in some sense, whether it could be a writer or playwright or whatever, and that sense of catharsis, because you really want to write about something that you've been kind of holding on to, and that is part, I think, sometimes part of the process. I think what's really interesting though is in terms of audiences, I've kind of seen both. So I've seen work which is maybe been made by a Muslim creative, and yes, you might have primarily like a Muslim audience. But on the flip side, sometimes you have a story which is you can see is absolutely about something to do with Muslim identity, and then like majority of the people in the audience are just like old white people.
Mm.
It's like, what is happening here? Like, so I find it really intriguing what how I don't know, like I don't really know what to say, like what is taking place, or what are some of the intentions that people are coming with, and I think I'm always sometimes a bit mindful of this kind of I sense of voyeurism, because you can create work, and sometimes I think again it's changing a little bit, but I think we have fallen a little bit into this like how to say, kind of mining our trauma a bit too much. And of course I totally get it, it's understandable, like we literally have been post 9/11, that there's so much we kind of need to get out from like inside of us. But I have always worried that if we have a play or a certain poem or a particular performance that is kind of rooted in that, if you then have um people who are coming to see that play that aren't of that same kind of lived experience, okay, why are they there, and what impact is this happening? And not to say that there is no impact, of course there is, and I'm sure it is positive. But yeah, so there's something there about navigating that kind of sense of voyeurism, and yeah, and not being pigeonholed. And to be honest, I think I've fallen into that trap, because like I mentioned, a lot of my personal projects have been around working with specifically British Muslim women. I run a women's only book club. There's so many events that I do that tend to be centered around Muslim women. I do sometimes feel that I also need to be um, I don't know, careful is not the right word, but as in just to understand how that might be perceived, and is that creating a barrier that is not intentional on my part? Because I have worked with like various organizations to do so many different things which have nothing necessarily to do with faith or identity. Um so yeah, I think there's something there. Yeah, I think this is something that's kind of constantly in the back of your mind,
Mm.
um to think about.
So I think there's Like there's a distinction to be made with who something is written for and who something will be consumed by or should be consumed by. So, for example, if there's a play, this is a play as an example, it's written in a way that will be very relatable to Muslims. It will probably make them feel seen and understood. And it's written for them, like from the heart, it's written for them. But that doesn't mean that it should not be consumed by non-Muslims or a very white audience, for example. What it is that the white audience should not expect that this play has been written for them in that way. That for them to their experience of it is one of observance, of education, is not one of relatability.
Mm.
We can't expect, and it works the other way as well, right?
Yeah, of
We
course.
can't expect, for example, I don't watch Christmas movies to feel like I can relate to them. I watch it for the entertainment factor, right? Or the feel good. Like I don't watch it because I'm not looking to feel seen in those movies. And I understand that those movies are not made to make me feel seen, but I can still appreciate them and learn from them. I have learned a lot about Christmas tradition from these movies I had no idea about before. So and and it works the other way. I think what we find is that there is an entitlement from a large proportion of the public that feel as though everything should be, if not written for them, but catered to
Mm.
them,
Mm.
and that creates such a barrier. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the main one of the main things that popped into my mind as you were speaking was something. Let's say you're going to a theatre space, and maybe as a producer, and you kind of suggest to have a dry bar because you're like,
Mm,
we're catering with a particular audience here who don't tend to drink alcohol. You do not need to be selling it, at
mm,
the bar, and that can almost become a point of contention sometimes, and not with all spaces. Some are actually very good and accommodating, and it's fine. But I find that really interesting because um, you obviously want to you're commercializing on something. Of course you want to make money, and obviously that, people buying drinks at the bar is a big part of that. But at the same time, but what matters to you right now, that you're saying that you want to reach a more quote unquote diverse audience, but then you're not actually really willing to make the decisions around that space to feel, to make people feel welcome, let's say. um, so that, I think, always, I guess, leaves me feeling a little bit maybe disheartened, because to some extent, spaces are very good at saying we really want to program all these amazing, plays, or a particular series of workshops or whatever it might be. But actually they're not thinking more holistically about what is the message that they're actually really trying to portray here. Do you just want to get like bums on seats so you can, again, what we were saying about this kind of tick box exercise, or you want to make meaningful change here, in which case
mm.
actually you should be able to adapt quite easily, and it shouldn't really pose an issue. um, so yeah, I mean, that was kind of one of the main examples, I think, sometimes I think comes up and I've had experience with. Or offering things like prayer space, because you've decided a show or a performance is a particular time that actually clashes with prayer time, especially when it comes to evenings. um, or even matinee performances, let's say. So again, yeah, it's all of these things. Have you got a really tiny room somewhere right in the back of
Mhm.
the thing where you can barely fit two people in? Is that what you call kind of provision?
Mm.
Or are you saying, no, actually we've allocated a really decent space and this is what it looks like, and yes, we have a dry bar, and all these things. So yeah, it's all part of the conversation, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that, that is a really important element about how we make creative spaces, physical spaces practical, not practical, accessible.
Mm.
How do we make them inclusive? And if they, this word inclusivity is thrown around so much, but is it really understood? Um, is it really understood and put into practice in a way that makes it fully inclusive? It feels like a very, like, like you've discussed before, like a very tick boxy exercise with, you know, for people to announce their pronouns, for example, seems to be a great way to demonstrate inclusivity, but you're not going beyond that in any real or meaningful way. And just as you were talking, I was thinking about how in literature there's always, well, not always, but there is such a push for the English language speaker to have the literature accessible to them in a way that makes sense to them. And we saw it recently with plays as well, that plays that now have subtitles or captions running across. And this idea that everything that's being presented in this story should be made easy to understand by the English speaker, or yeah, or an audience that isn't necessarily the book that's written about that particular audience. So, for example, you can have a book that has the Urdu language in it or the Bengali language in it, and for those words and phrases that are being used to not have a direct translation, and there seems to be uproar. They're like, "Oh, I can't connect with this book because I've not seen in front of me the direct translation of this word." And actually, authors are not stupid, right? So, like, more often than not, the context within which those words are written, you can understand them, right? Like, what's been said 2 lines up based on the answer that's come from the next person speaking in that script, right? Like, it's not something that requires a lot of work. You don't actually go and have to pick up a Macaulay dictionary to understand what's being written. But there's this demand almost that, like, no, no, but I want it clear. And that extends also to certain practices. So, like, "Oh, well, I don't have an explanation of what Diwali is in this book. I don't have an explanation of what Eid or Ramadan is." But it's just like, come on, you can make a little bit of effort to find out. And actually, even if you're not gonna go and Google it, if you read the book, you'll probably pretty much get it. Like, you'll understand, "Oh, it's a celebration." Like, that is often all you need to know for the thing that you're trying to engage with. But there's such a reluctance of that. And again, this I feel like is what comes back down to, like, inclusivity, because for me to have like an over explanation of language or cultural traditions or religious based traditions feels just like boring. Like, it feels tiresome to read it, because I don't need you to explain to me what praying is, or what the shahada is. Like, I don't need you to do that, because, and also, the characters in the book wouldn't ordinarily go around defining these principles to their friends, right? It wouldn't happen. You don't do
Yeah,
that in your day-to-day life. So it
yeah,
feels so unnatural.
yeah.
Um, and it's something that I think there is a movement, it's called, like, the decolonization of literature. Like, let's move away from the focus on the English language. And I've read books actually fairly recently that now really try and own this, and will have, like, maybe like an entire page written, and not just in a different language, but it will be in the script of that language. So you really can't read it, but you have to understand what that's trying to tell you. You're not expected as the reader to go and to translate it, but if you put it into the context of the book and of the story, what's it trying to say to you about what that stands for? But I feel like people just want it handed to them on a plate, and it's very frustrating.
Mm. I guess it's coming back to what you say, that sense of entitlement,
Mm.
and being so used to being always centered, and how then if suddenly feels to say, actually, you're not the center anymore. And, like you said, that that your role at the moment is now as an observer, as somebody who's, yes, is consuming, but not with this kind of expectation to, I must be educated, I need to, be able to engage fully within this space, otherwise it's not for me. So it's kind of like you said, it is decentering that particular gaze. It definitely is something about decolonization there. And it's just so funny, isn't it? Because you do assume that we have this idea of the power of deduction. Like, in the context you're reading something, more often than not, you will be able to figure out what is being said, even if you can't access the language. But you have to, it makes me think that we're talking sometimes about people who completely butcher our names, which is sometimes very
Yeah.
simple, right? So we kind of almost think, well, you've got, if it's so complex that even getting someone's name right feels like this massive kind of exercise in whatever it might be. It's so strange. And I think that, again, I have seen work where maybe artists do feel like they do need to have that glossary, they do need to have that kind of um, extra information. And sometimes I can understand that to an extent, but then what happens is it's come back to that question of who have you written, or who is it written for? Because then when you're in that space and you are kind of taking something in, it suddenly feels like, oh god, am I in some sort of lesson about like wudu, or am I in a lesson about Ramadan, or whatever it might be, right? It's
Mm,
suddenly like, oh, it feels a little bit not natural.
mm,
Um, and obviously you want to be able to appeal to all audiences, and I totally understand that. And I mean, and on the flip side, I'm thinking about the time I went to see opera, and it's my first experience. I absolutely fell in love with it. And that's in a completely different language, but yes, they did have subtitles. But I don't remember relying so much on that. I was just really happy to be there and just immersing myself in this absolutely amazing kind of a performance within that space. And obviously we can talk, there's a whole separate conversation about opera and how inaccessible it is. But generally, I think it's okay just say, you know what, I want to go and try something new, and yeah, just immerse myself in it, and just take whatever comes. I think that
mm,
sometimes just should be enough.
yeah.
But yeah, I guess everyone approaches things in a different way. But yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the sort of reluctance that there is with people sort of refusing to engage or distancing themselves from literature, or even like on screen or on stage production, where they feel like, oh, I'm not given everything. I'm not given all the information here. I think it's such a shame, because what ends up happening is then that person ends up distancing themselves from the entire piece of work. And actually, I think the thing that a lot of, I mean, I speak for myself, actually, let me not speak for anybody else, but I know for me, like, so much of what I want to say to people is that so many of my experiences are very specific to me being a Muslim, but also so much of it is universal. Like, my experiences as a woman, so many of them are very common with women from all types of backgrounds. My experiences as a daughter, as a wife, as somebody that's like fallen in love and gotten married and experienced grief, like these are all universal experiences. And yeah, they are impacted and shaped by my cultural and religious background and heritage and who I am, but there's so much there that's universal. And so when you close yourself off to that, that is what continues to keep up these barriers, right? That's what makes it feel like, well, I can't understand your grief or your joy because you've not presented it to me in a language that I easily understand, or you've not translated every word to me, so I'm not going to think about the ways in which I can really relate to your grief and your joy. But that is exactly the opposite of the the point that we're trying to make, which is that these are also universe there's so much universality. Like, I was talking to somebody recently, this idea about like so much about when we talk about what's happening in Gaza, people will say like, oh, well, just imagine like if that was you, or if that was your child. And we don't have to put ourselves in the shoes of other people in order to understand that this is universally wrong. You don't have to imagine losing your child to know that the death of an innocent child is wrong. Like, we don't have to do that, right? And so, but you have to be open to understanding that this is like the human condition and a universal experience. And it's just, yeah, it feels like such a shame and just a reminder that there's still so much work to do.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, in terms of, um, you know, when we see all the images that are coming out of Gaza at the moment, and it's, yeah, that kind of sense of, actually, we need to kind of be engaging in a way when we talk about things like social justice. What does that mean? That transcends borders, and it
Mm.
transcends culture and faith, to an extent, because we are literally talking about, you know other human beings. And when we get into the habit of allowing a particular group of people to be dehumanized, I guess what we're seeing right now is almost kind of the consequence and the outcome of that. And then this idea of then becoming complicit by being silent. And I think that's
Mm.
what's been so positive. If I can say, I mean, positive is not necessarily the right word, but the one thing that really has come out of the past year and a half is the fact that so many artists have been coming together to create spaces to kind of bear witness, to make sure that actually we are kind of collectively coming together to speak out. And and I think, in some sense, maybe coming back to the fact, you mentioned that, I run a book club, and out of so much of the work that I do, it really, is important to me, and obviously I'm really passionate about it. But there is something about book club that we are able to come together as women, regardless of faith, and all those kind of different labels that we have, and actually just really connect on each of our lived experiences, and really build, or kind of really foster, that kind of nurturing environment for all of us. And that means then, because when we talk about safe spaces, of course, there's no true, I guess, safe space really, because you don't know what can happen at any given
Mm.
moment. But ultimately, though, if you can kind of do something with integrity, and I think, yeah, like I said, have that kind of nurturing and compassionate outlook on life, you really are able to then come together and talk about things that are important, and that are going on in the world,
Mm.
in a way where you kind of, I guess, doing something which, inshallah, will kind of make that difference. And I always say this, that we can feel very overwhelmed when there's so much going on around the world, but we always have to think about, okay, in our own certain sphere, what are the ripple effects that we can make, right? And then,
Mm.
because ultimately it is those little ripples, and then we'll come together and kind of create a big wave of change, hopefully.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just I mean, it has been really heartening, I think, to see how many people have been able to use creativity as a form of resistance and protest, and how that has helped other people, I think, also express how they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And yeah, I just think that that's so important in a world that feels so fractured and polarized and scary to navigate, even if it is creativity just for yourself. I think just that form of processing. We've been talking about like representation and also like accessibility and stuff. And I think although there is greater representation of Muslims in literature and on stage and on screen, my personal view is that there is still so far to go with how good, quote unquote, that representation is, or how authentic it is, or how um, I find that a lot of representation is still palatable to the white gaze. It's still feeding a narrative. It's still sort of, sitting with certain stereotypes, and I find that incredibly frustrating. But I wondered what you think are, when it comes to Muslim narratives and representation, what are some of the things that are still undone or overdone or misrepresented?
Oh man, I mean, where do you start? Like, I mean, immediately that one image comes to my mind. I have no idea what program this was. It's always a clip that gets shared of some one character, and she has, I assume, what might be a vodka shot or something. She goes Bismillah, and then she takes this big swig, right? And I'm like, what is going on? Like, who decided that? Like, what is that? you know,
Yeah.
or the famous clip of oh gosh, I can't remember again what film it is, and so the character's praying, and it does not look like anything like the prayer that
Yeah.
we pray as Muslims, right? And so there's all these things, and of course, maybe it doesn't happen so much to this extent, but we still have that, this kind of wanting to unveil the visible Muslim woman, like
Mm.
for her to kind of rip her hijab off, and to see all this absolutely unflat hair, which is completely unrealistic because how wavy really is it going to be under there, right? After wearing it all day, I really can't, anyway. But so those things, we laugh about it, and but it's frustrating, right? But it's
Mm.
good because things are changing, and I think naturally it would, because we have more Muslim creatives going into the sector, and kind of making work. Even though I have to say, sometimes we can be like just as like we can be culprits as well. Again, I think
Mm.
it's what we were saying about sometimes we're falling into that trap of we want to break stereotypes, so we suddenly go from, oh no, Muslim women aren't oppressed, oh look, she knows how to skateboard, or
Mm.
she rides a motorbike or something, it's like so we're kind of trapped in this narrative of wanting to challenge certain stereotypes, but at the same time just wanting to be true to ourselves. I think we're all still kind of on our journey, but like I said, it's been really wonderful to recently, and of course, because I have a particular interest in theatre, I normally end up talking about plays, but it is really refreshing to have seen recent plays that just don't feel like that. They just feel really
Mm.
real, and you can kind of go and sit and think, you know what, yeah, this could be my brother, or this could be my friend, or this could, you know or yeah, whatever it might kind of feel like. And I think that's really important. So yeah, I mean, representation, I guess with me, I try not to overthink too much about it now. I think there was a time that I did, but now I really just, when I'm trying to decide what to go see, it really is just thinking, is this something that sounds really fun and interesting? In which case I'll go. Is this
Mm.
something that actually really speaks to me in terms of what we were talking about, kind of social issues? And then, and it doesn't really matter to me necessarily who's written it, or where it is. Um, so yeah, representation of course is important, more stuff needs to be done, but I really feel like if we can just continue making the work that we feel is important to us,
Mm.
that hopefully will just kind of make that change in that kind of cultural ecosystem,
Mm.
kind of over time, I guess, slowly.
Yeah, and you said that you're most interested in plays,
Mm.
and I was just thinking that I actually think that I feel like the best, or like the most impactful storylines I've seen are on stage when it comes to Muslim representation. And I haven't seen a huge amount, but I know that there is more available. And yeah, I just wondered, like, do you think that is in part due to the medium, that with like TV, for example, or Netflix series or even movies, because because their aim is to get everyone watching them, you're hyper aware that your audience is very different. Whereas with a play, I think there is a more of like an opt-in culture. Like, that the audience is gonna be more, in some ways, curated, it's gonna be more specific. It feels like with plays, in the same way that I think often about books, is that like the audience find the thing that they're looking for. But on TV, I don't think of that in the same way. And I wondered if you had any insights as to whether that might be the case.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because I think absolutely you're right. I think there's maybe a couple of bits to it, because there's the first thing about trying to enter the kind of the TV world and the barriers that exist there compared to, for example, something like theatre. I think it is, very, very different. Even from, for example, from my own experience, I have worked, for example, with filmmakers to do short documentaries, and trying to access funding is very different for
Mm.
if you want to try to make film compared to getting funding to, put on a play, for example. Personally, I've found, that pathway a bit easier, in terms of working in live performance. So I think there's obviously maybe a particular barrier there. Um, but at the same time, I think, yeah, you're right, because TV is, it's the way, I guess, we consume TV is so, so different. And again, complete taking on board your point about that kind of creation of audiences. I mean, there have been, I guess, shows recently where you do see more of that representation that we were talking
Mm.
about. But again, bits of it are so problematic still.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, this is making me feel really kind of uncomfortable that, oh, is this why it got the green light? Because it had
Mm.
certain elements to it. Whereas I think within the theatre space, maybe even in terms of literature, you can still hold your own in terms of your voice and not
Mm.
have to maybe compromise too much.
Mm.
So yeah, I think, I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't think I've got maybe an exact answer, but
Mm.
definitely, there's so much more problematic things I think we've seen over the years, in terms of missing reputation on TV, which is so, so damaging and quite detrimental, really. Um,
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning as well. You talked about that, that there is increased representation on TV as well, but then there will be elements that feel so uncomfortable or are problematic. And I think the same about literature. Like, there is so much more like visible representation of um a diversity of backgrounds of characters. A lot more literature written about Asian characters or Muslim characters. And I still find overwhelmingly that the ones that are deemed like popular, there is more often than not still something in there, even if it's small, but in some cases it's really large as well, that is unhelpful or problematic or still like linked to some of the stereotypes that we're trying to break. And if yeah, and so you think like, would you rather have this like book written by a brown author and to be able to have this brown author talking about their work, but if that brown author is still talking about freedom with one of their characters escaping with a white boy, for example, like like, is there a balance there? Is it still better that they're there than they're not? Like, it is really, really tough, but it's still definitely there. And it's just, yeah. I also think TikTok does not help with these things.
okay, so you know what? I'm not on TikTok, right? But I'm telling you, yeah, that just feels like it's this kind of,
I also am not. I'm not on TikTok. As in, I don't have TikTok. But
yeah.
you go into the shops now and it's like, oh, book talk
Yeah,
recommend. Da, da, da.
yeah.
And what do they recommend? A smut.
Yeah, no, I know that because I've got two daughters, and they're constantly coming home from school. They're like, "Oh, but this book my friend recommended," because I mean, because my girls aren't on TikTok either, but
Mm,
it's TikTok is constantly on their vocab. It's like,
mm.
oh my god, like social media is really, oh, such a pain, right? To be honest,
Yeah,
and yeah, that definitely
it,
introduces more problems than not.
it is.
Um,
It's really, really tough.
so
Um, so before we begin to wrap up, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about funding and how difficult it is, I think, as a Muslim creative who wants to take their creativity into the professional realm. Now, I don't have much experience of this at all, but I know that you do. How difficult is it to get funding to do the kind of work that you want to do that isn't policed heavily, but allows you to, you know, produce art in whatever medium that is creative? Yeah, what are some of the challenges when it comes to finding funding? And maybe if you have any tips or suggestions for anyone that might be looking.
yeah, I would say that generally speaking, my experience of trying to access funding for projects has been extremely positive. I've pretty much been mm, always successful, I would say, in being able to kind of be successful in those applications. There are organizations that kind of support in terms of that bid writing and being able to signpost you, and all of that's been super, super helpful. I've never felt up. I've never really felt that I have to create work which is palatable, or had that sense that my work is being censored or policed in any way. Um, so that's definitely still, a really, really good thing. I mean, having said that, I know that, maybe in the past year or so, it does feel like certain bodies that kind of issue grants and funding, they've maybe introducing certain changes where they're not explicitly saying you can't be political, but it
Mm.
sometimes feels like that if you're reading between the lines. And that, I think, sometimes
Mm.
does worry me a little bit, because all art is political. Anybody who says otherwise obviously doesn't really understand the point of what they're doing. So, coming from that sense of entitlement and privilege that, oh no, art should just be for art's sake. Well, that's just not the case for so many people in the true sense anyway. So yeah, there might be a slight shift potentially moving forward, but I think generally speaking, there are lots of organizations that you can go to. The best thing really is to approach maybe your local arts center, your university, or there will be organizations and institutions that you can honestly just like drop them an email and really find out, because we just don't know that there is so much funding that does come through. um, and I would say it might be contradictory to what I was saying when we initially started talking, but that sometimes things are a bit tick boxy. Use it to your advantage. Say yes,
Mm.
I'm ticking all of these boxes for you, give me that money, right? So yeah, sometimes you just use it to your advantage, because actually ultimately they have money, you want money to create work, and you know you then get to almost have that kind of sense and control of what it is that you want to put out there, and I think that's really good. So yeah, that's obviously definitely very much a personal reflection on my own kind of journey and experience. So yeah, on the whole, it has been good, it has been positive. um yeah, so it's just kind of fingers crossed that it kind of just continues that way.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good. I
Mm,
think that will be helpful and and hopeful,
mm,
um, for anyone listening that is thinking about applying for funding or is looking for opportunities, because there are opportunities out there. I know it can feel like there's not, but I think it's just about staying persistent with it as well, and making sure that you identify different platforms where that money will become available, and understand funding cycles and all of the intricacies, so that you don't miss, because obviously often they're deadline driven
mm,
and
mm, mm.
they're in cycles also.
Can I just
Yeah.
quickly add, just
Mm.
really quickly, the fact, I mean, to be honest, that's probably primarily why I'm kind of work as a creative producer, because I'm not necessarily the one creating work, but what I really
Mm.
want to do is be able to support artists, and
Mm.
that would, is kind of forms part of my role. That there could be somebody with an idea who isn't sure where to go or how they might put something on, and I would like for that to kind of be my role in being able to enable that. So sometimes, yeah, just see who are the other creatives are out there who might be able to give you that support, and maybe mentorship as well. So I think that can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as we finish, because I have really enjoyed speaking to you. Obviously, we are in the month of Ramadan. How do you think Ramadan has or does impact your creativity, if at all?
Oh, that's such a good question. I guess, I guess creativity just looks different at different times. And in Ramadan, I think my reading habit might just change. So whereas I might usually be reading maybe a fiction book, I just kind of immerse myself in the Quran. And actually,
Mm.
even the nature of the Quran is, it really is truly creative. It's come from our creator, and whether it's the melodious way of kind of hearing recitation, whether it's the calligraphy on the pages, and I think it just, you just start reflecting on the world in a different way. And I think that's, yeah, and I think that's lovely. But I mean, I've been really lucky this year to be involved with a project that I've worked on called Creative Roots, and that's actually allowed me to kind of work with artists to put workshops in the run up to Ramadan, and kind of part of it, and that's been really nice. I think for me and for kind of other people to, yeah, to kind of continue that engagement in that form of kind of self expression. Yeah, at a time when we're just feeling really kind of quite soulful, and feeling really quite deeply connected with our own selves, and kind of, you know, the rest of the community as well. So yeah,
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Imrana. It's been such a privilege speaking to you. It's been really, really great.
thank you.
I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review, as it can really help.